Good morning and welcome to today's webinar, Building Australia's SAF Industry Inside the Project Pipeline. I'm Shahana McKenzie, the CEO of Bioenergy Australia. Bioenergy Australia is the national industry body dedicated to accelerating Australia's bioeconomy. Through our work, we are committed to advocating for supportive policy and market mechanisms to drive the development of Australia's low-carbon liquid fuels and renewable gas sectors. We have two key alliances, the Low Carbon Fuels Alliance of Australia and New Zealand and the Renewable Gas Alliance. Across those alliances, we have around 600 stakeholders across the entire supply chain, working together to accelerate deployment and reduce our emissions. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm speaking on today. I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the various lands on which our attendees are coming from and pay my respects to elders past and present. I also extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that may be joining us today. A few quick housekeeping items. Please make sure that you introduce yourself and where you're watching in the chat box if you're engaging in the chat. Please make sure that you use the Q&A box for any questions that you do have for our speakers. That goes into a separate area. So that's the only spot that we will be looking at in terms of for questions. And the final is that today's session is being recorded and will be shared with all registered attendees on our YouTube channel. Today's webinar, we have over 360 people registered, and I think this is our fifth webinar in the series that we have been running over the last couple of months. And we'd really encourage anyone that has any suggestions or ideas of topics, projects, anything really that you think would be great to be showcasing as part of our webinar program, please feel free to get in touch with the team with those suggestions. Okay, Australia's sustainable aviation fuel industry is moving rapidly from ambition towards commercialisation, with a growing pipeline of projects spanning multiple feedstocks, technologies and supply chains. As global demand for low-carbon fuels and aviation fuels accelerates, Australia is uniquely positioned to leverage its abundant feedstock resources, technical expertise and growing policy momentum to become a leading global producer of SAF. Today, we are very pleased to hold this webinar to provide an overview of Australia's SAF project landscape, bringing together industry leaders to showcase some of the nation's most advanced SAF projects. Our speakers today will explore the technologies, partnerships and investment strategies underpinning these projects, while discussing what is needed to accelerate deployment and establish a globally competitive domestic SAF industry in Australia. The webinar will conclude with an audience Q&A with our speakers, so please make sure you pop your questions in that Q&A box. So to kick things off, we are joined by Dr. Fraser Thompson, co-founder and managing partner of Scion Ventures and the domestic chair of the Low Carbon Fuels Alliance of Australia and New Zealand. Fraser also leads the Green Accelerator program, supporting the growth of Australia's emerging low carbon fuel sector. He'll open the session with an overview of Australia's SAF landscape and the market outlook. Welcome, Fraser.
Thank you very much, Shahana. And I'm very much the appetizer before the main course of speakers that are going to be coming today. So I just thought what I'd do is just set a bit of the scene of where we are as an industry, some of the opportunities, but also some of the issues that we have faced. And the material that I'm going to be sharing is based on a series of different information sources. One is a clean deal monitor that Scion Ventures does with Mission Possible Partnership, where we track all the green industry projects across Australia, and we do regular surveys to understand the constraints, as well as a series of investor and project workshops that we've done over the last 12 months. So if we go to the first slide, please, just to give you a sense of the pipeline of low carbon liquid fuels in Australia. So if you look at the left-hand side, we only track sort of post-feasibility projects here. And I know there's a ton of really exciting, early stage projects that are obviously not captured in here. But we have roughly, 12 projects that we're looking at. 6 of them are in pre-feed, 4 in feed. And if you look at the total capex associated with those projects in construction, we're talking about over $19 billion. and the potential output is potentially transformative. So if all of those projects were dedicated to sustainable aviation fuel, for example, we can meet roughly 17% of Australia's total aviation fuel demand. So, a really exciting pipeline. But you see here that the one sort of row that's missing is FID and financial close. And so the really key challenge is, how do we get some of these great projects that are in this development stage over the line with the kind of equity and debt structures that they'll need for their substantial construction capital. If we go to the next slide, thank you. And there's some key gaps in adoption readiness. So the US Department of Energy actually had a really helpful framework where they looked at adoption readiness of different sectors. This is basically, think of it as kind of a toolkit to say how ready are these different sectors to scale. And if you look here, there's a few key gaps when it comes to low carbon liquid fuels. We have demand maturity concerns. We still have a significant price premium to conventional fossil fuels in many sectors. And we don't yet have the demand side mechanisms in place, although hopefully with the announcement in May of a low carbon liquid fuel demand mechanism, that will start to change. There's some gaps in downstream infrastructure. Capital flows, we still have some gaps in particular areas, particularly around the missing middle of that kind of pre-feed and feed capital that we see across many green industries, but particularly in low carbon liquid fuels. And some other gaps in terms of supply chain areas, etc. So we do have some key issues to work on. If we go to the next slide, I want to go a bit deeper into some of these issues. We did a survey of low carbon liquid fuel and other green industry projects to understand their key barriers. And I won't go through all of these, but it's interesting to highlight that all of them talked about the challenges with risk capital. So early stage risk capital for first of a kind projects and pre-FID funding. And then a lot of the other issues are familiar ones that we've talked about before. So uncertainty on demand creation mechanisms, finding de-risking mechanisms for investors, the investor fit, so the mandate fit, the awareness, etc. So there's a number of particular concerns that we need to start to make progress on. Go to the next slide, please. On the demand side, we had a workshop in October last year where we brought investors and we brought projects together, and we tried to delve into some of these issues. And here's with just a couple of the excerpts from that. On the demand side, a big push was around demand mandates and standards, the first one there, and terrific to see that announcement. And I think we're all looking forward to the consultation mechanism that's going to be coming out shortly. And the key really is to make sure that mandate or standard is really fit for purpose, that delivers those the certainty that those projects need to get to financial close. If we go to the next slide, thank you. I want to talk about the financing, and there are a number of really interesting proposals that were brought forward. Government loan guarantees, regional export finance consortia, contract for difference mechanisms, etc. So all dealing with issues from tenor length of offtake contracts, counterparty risk, and trying to find innovative ways to de-risking. And the good news is that the government is extremely receptive to these ideas. And there's been many discussions which are ongoing at the moment about how do we create the right kind of support package for that. Going to the next slide, thanks. I want to talk about a final gap, which is around how do we provide more targeted support to first-of-a-kind projects and their teams. Even the best founder teams are going to struggle with the breadth of gaps and challenges in this area, dealing with missing supply chains, offtake contracts don't have a precedent, etc. So Simon Ventures, we're launching a Green Fuels Accelerator, and thank you to our many partners from Qantas to Boeing to Mission Possible Partnership, Climate Tech Partners, and support from Arena, which is taking 7 projects and providing some targeted support over the next 8 months to help speed the process to get them to financial close. This is a pilot, and we're looking forward in our next cohort to bring in a broader range of firms. So thank you to the many firms that have reached out to us, and we can't support right at the moment, but we are looking forward to next cohort to opening that up, and we'll be doing a series of webinars, hopefully at Bioenergy Australia, to actually showcase some of that. And then finally, just those 7 projects that on the last slide include, we have Licella to here with Andrea, so great to have Andrea presenting, and we also have the likes of Wagner, Renergy, Wildfire, and EthTech. And look, along with the likes of Jet Zero and Hammer here today, I think it's exciting the kind of innovative projects we've got in the pipeline at the moment. And the real key for us is how do we take this potential and really transform into reality, and Australia becomes a low carbon fuel powerhouse. So thanks for your time, and looking forward to hearing the rest of the presentations.
Thanks so much, Fraser. Always great to hear what you are up to, and incredibly exciting in terms of the accelerator. Our next speaker, and please make sure if you have any questions for Fraser, please make sure that you pop those into the Q&A box. Up next, we have Andrea Paulson from Licella, a company advancing renewable fuel technologies through its CAT HDR platform. Andrea is the General Manager, Stakeholder Engagement and Communications at Licella, and has over 15 years management experience across the low carbon technology, renewable energies, and pharmaceutical industries. Andrea is going to present on Project Swift, a proposed biorefinery in the Bundaberg region of Queensland. Welcome, Andrea.
Thanks, Shahana. Thank you to Bioenergy Australia for inviting Licella to present. It's a great time to be part of this conversation, and as Fraser so eloquently outlined, I think with the policy consultations that's imminent, we're all feeling optimistic, and I think, looking forward to some progress building a domestic low carbon liquid fuel industry in Australia. Next slide. Thanks, Georgie. So look, this will not be a surprise to anybody here in the room, but clearly to meet the scale of the challenge and the opportunity for SAF in particular, we really need to unlock feedstock and feedstock, a breadth of feedstock that can deliver both scale and lowest cost of carbon abatement, but also fuel security, which of course is a critical driver to building a low carbon liquid fuel and SAF industry, alongside obviously those decarbonisation levers, particularly in aviation. SAF is the most viable medium to long term, particularly anything over a few hour flight. Certainly SAF is going to play a key role, for those medium to long haul flights within the next 25 plus years. So it's a really important tool to decarbonise aviation. Next slide. And I think that so this is interesting because what it's looking at is feedstocks, and it's mapping both the potential for emissions reductions on the x-axis, looking at it from CORSIA, life cycle emissions factor, but then also supply. So this is global, it's very high level, but it's just to highlight that I think we will need a suite of solutions, so a suite of different technology pathways, and that's why it's great that each of the projects here is representing different pathways to unlock different feedstocks and also technology pathways in themselves. But for Australia, we have a really exciting opportunity to unlock some of these, I guess, what you could call future-proof feedstocks, which are those that combine a high potential supply with a high potential for emission reductions. Things like wood residues from forestry, but also, of course, a whole range of biomass residues from the agricultural sector. And then over time as well, even, some future feedstocks in the MSW space with the organic waste streams. And that's certainly not to say that some of these other feedstocks don't play a role. They absolutely do. I think what we'll need is a really balanced approach, which is unlocking different feedstocks, both in the short, medium term, and then also the longer term. And next slide. Thanks. So for those of you that may not be familiar with Licella, so we're Australian-based but global technology project development company. So we have a technology platform which is CAD-HTR. It's a form of hydrothermal liquefaction, or HTL. One of the advantages of HTL as a platform is that we have a lot of flexibility on the feedstock. So we can essentially take any biomass, whether that's wood-based or agricultural and other wastes, and convert that into a bio oil using our HTL process. And then from there, we've also got optionality on the upgrading. So the bio oil can be upgraded into SAF, but of course into other low carbon fuels such as renewable diesel and fuels for the marine sector as well. Next slide, thank you. So this, to summarize just what I've said, so the HTL platform itself uses water as its key processing medium. So it's the combination of the biomass with supercritical water, so water under high pressure and temperature, which converts the biomass, which is solid, into that liquid bio oil. And then via our collaboration with partners, so we have a global upgrading collaboration with Shell, towards a integrated end-to-end biomass to biofuel solution, which is what we're doing both globally and here in Australia with Project Swift. Next slide, thanks. So I won't spend too long on this, but just out of interest for those that may not be familiar with HTL, so the feedstock, the biomass, goes into the front end of the process, then is mixed with the supercritical water. It's actually the time, the residence time of that biomass with the supercritical water in the reactors, which causes that conversion to the bio oil. And that's around 20 minutes. So it's actually a very quick process. After that product is depressurized and separated, we have the end product from our process, the bio oil, which is then refined in that collaboration with partners, or can potentially also be co-processed, and we recover water and heat from the process back through, so it's very efficient. We also produce a renewable CO2, which is potentially an additional product from the process. So we are this is sort of the magic of it is the water. Next slide. And we've developed this here in Australia, so it's great that it's Australian innovation. It's being commercialised globally. We have a commercial demonstration facility on the central coast of New South Wales, which we've progressively scaled up through different commercial stages. Our first full-scale commercial facility, the Arbius facility, is in British Columbia in Canada, and that is in the operational ramp-up phase, and that's a small commercial facility which has been designed to be modular. So a lot of the learnings from that our Arbius facility are being applied here to the project in Australia, Project Swift. As Shahana mentioned, we're proposing to locate in the Bundaberg region, working with a sugar mill there, the ISIS Central Sugar Mill. We've completed the pre-feed stage and are advancing towards feed. We've started some foundational work on the feed. That project is taking in its first stage around 150,000 tonnes of agricultural residues, converting that to 56,000 tonnes per annum of bio oil, which would be around 60 million litres of low carbon fuels, of which around 40 million could be SAF. And we're grateful that we've received funding from ARENA to support the pre-feed and feed stage of Project Swift. Next slide, thanks, Georgie. So just quickly to mention the facility in Canada, the reason that it's important for us is it's our pioneer facility, and this is where what we're doing in Bundaberg is really a scale up of this. So the modular design, you can see here, this image is actually from the construction last year, but everything has been brought in and designed to fit together quite neatly on site, and the front end and the back end are right-sized for a much larger plant. So the plan is this is currently 25,000 tonne per annum facility to expand to 75,000 tonnes. And that modular design is really guiding the project development here in Australia. Next slide, thanks. So Project Swift, as I mentioned, we're working with the ISA Central Sugar Mill. We also have our engineering partner Technip supporting the project. And we're looking at, some potential synergies in the bio hub there. There's a really, I think, exciting opportunity for some other bio projects and how they interface with each other. We have an MOU with LMS Energy, who are looking to develop a anaerobic digester, and there's some potential synergies in terms of different products from the mill, from our facility, and then how we can actually offtake some of that energy. And obviously, being renewable gas, that also helps to optimize the carbon intensity of the products, of the SAF products. Next slide, thanks. So we're progressing through. We've done a lot of work as part of the pre-feed and commencing some of those foundational feed pieces of activity at the moment. So, and I think, what would be great as a group here, I think, to discuss today is for the projects like ours, which are in feed and advancing, through that, and ultimately to get to a final investment decision point. What are those enabling policies, both on the demand and supply side, which are going to help enable that positive FID position for projects? Next slide, thanks. Now, I won't dwell on these. This is actually available. So ARENA, as part of the funding for projects, provide a knowledge sharing hub, which is really great. There's some great documents on there, and encourage everyone that hasn't had a look at that portal to have a look. So any ARENA funded projects will produce knowledge sharing reports. There are a number of them, and looking at things that projects need to consider along the way. Clearly, offtake is a really important driver of FID for projects, and the role of policy there. And then also, things like carbon intensity versus cost trade-off, and what do these first of kind facilities look like compared to those nth facilities? Next slide, thanks. And again, just to obviously the role of government policy and funding there to underpin key investments into projects. And obviously all those other factors as well are key: feedstock, product offtake, the engineering, the site, and the community support. But certainly government policy will be a key driver. I think we're almost there, Georgie, maybe one more. I don't have time to go into this, but the point that I wanted to make is that I think the role of consortiums in terms of helping to drive industry development will be really important. We're working with a consortium of companies, including Japan Airlines, Mitsubishi Chemicals, Boeing, for a pre-feasibility study on forestry residues to SAF in Japan. And I think for Australia, that will be an interesting potential, opportunity, and great to already see those dynamics at play with the Green Fuel Accelerator. So certainly an opportunity for projects to accelerate to deployment. Next slide. And that's it from me. And if you do want to reach out, my email's on the screen, and then our project page is available on the Licella's website. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Andrea. Really appreciate you participating and hearing more about the project. Okay, up next, we are welcoming Mac Irvine, the CFO of Jet Zero Australia. Mac was previously the investment director at the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, the Australian government-owned Green Bank, for over 8 years, where he led the CEFC's investments in bioenergy and the circular economy. Mac has extensive experience in corporate and project financing, deal structuring, and strategy and execution, both domestically and internationally across a variety of sectors. In addition to the CFC, Mac previously held banking and advisory roles at Barclays and KPMG in the UK. Today, Mac will speak on two Queensland projects, Project Ulysses in Townsville and Project Mandala in Gladstone. Welcome, Mac.
Thanks, Shahana. Great to be with you all today. So, look, in short, Jet Zero is a low-carbon liquid fuel project developer specialising in both sustainable aviation fuel and renewable diesel, and a longer-term ambition to be the operator of those facilities that we're developing as well. There's a few key pillars to the way that we look to develop our projects. The first is really taking a commercial lens to everything that we do. So just to be clear, we're not a technology development company. We're not an R&D company. We're all about how do we get molecules into the market as quickly as we possibly can. And over the 4-year journey since establishing the business, that's led us to focus on two primary pathways, being the alcohol to jet pathway, or ATJ, and the hydroprocessed esters and fatty acids pathway, or HEFA. So in short, the ATJ pathway, we're taking bioethanol and converting that into SAF and RD. And the HEFA pathway, we're taking oils effectively and those sorts of feedstocks, converting that to SAF and RD. And where we sit today is that's led us to be in a position to have Australia's most advanced SAF project based in Townsville called Project Ulysses, which I'll be touching on in a bit more detail shortly. I think in terms of sort of the discipline that we, progress our projects in this business, as well as the commercial frameworks that we utilize, it's really about how do we de-risk everything that we do. So Shahana just touched on it a moment ago, but my background's banking and finance, particularly project financing. So through each of the different, pieces of the puzzle, so to speak, when we're putting our projects together, it's all about how do we just de-risk those and being very conscious and very capital efficient with every dollar that we spend in the business on the projects that we're developing. And then the final point is that it's really the experience that we've got within the team. So we are a very lean team, but we've got incredible experience across things like project development, operations, engineering, and even sort of, across the banking and financial markets, given the need to raise significant capital for these projects as well. And we've got people coming from, really big companies such as Shell, Fluor Corporation, Woodside, and global investment banks that have the capability to bring these projects together and get them to FID. We're very lucky to have an incredible investor base as well. So we've got the likes of Qantas, obviously Australia's national carrier as an investor, alongside Airbus, who's the world's largest aircraft manufacturer, and Idemitsu of Japan. So notwithstanding them being a Japanese company, they're a very large global energy company, and they sit alongside a number of institutional investors as well. And for context, Jet Zero was the first investment that Qantas and Airbus made within their climate fund. And Jet Zero was also the first investment that Idemitsu made outside of Japan in the SAF space, recognizing that they are developing their own projects within Japan. And also very fortunate to count the Australian federal government and the Queensland state government as providers of capital for our projects. And I think just more broadly, the support that we've received, particularly within the Queensland state government through approvals and just general support along the way has been incredible. So I can't thank them enough. I'll be touching on primarily our two biorefinery projects today. So that's Project Ulysses, which is the ATJ project, and Project Mandala, being the HEFA project. But I did just want to make mention too of another project that we are working through at the moment called Project Silvo Plus, which is essentially an upstream HEFA feedstock project where we have actually planted a 10-hectare plantation of Pongamia about a year ago and working through a broader commercialization of that as well. In short, Project Ulysses, the ATJ project, look, that's a roughly 113 million litre per annum total production capacity. That has inherent flexibility within that project or that technology to produce anywhere from a sort of a 50-50 blend of RD and SAF to a 90% SAF and 10% RD blend. We have the ability to push that even further from an RD output perspective if we choose to, with some tweaks to that, so that we're working through. But I think it's just really important from having that sort of flexibility to be able to produce multiple products, and given the demand for both of those in Australia. The feedstock is an Australian ethanol. We call it 2G. It's effectively meaning it's a non-food ethanol, and it's currently being produced in Australia. So when we say 2G, we refer to second generation. For those who aren't familiar with the terminology, we really mean non-food. It's not a lignocellulosic type of technology producing that. It's an agricultural byproduct that's already been converted into ethanol. I mentioned the support of the Australian and Queensland governments earlier. So we've received roughly $15 million in total to date from both through feasibility and feed. Then most recently, $9 million of funding from ARENA and $5 million from the Queensland government for our feed phase, which we're currently in. LanzaJet is our technology licensor, LanzaJet being the most commercialised A to J pathway globally at the moment, having produced SAF renewable diesel on spec as of November of last year, and working through the final commissioning phase for steady operations at the moment. And Technip Energies is our current feed contractor for that project, who's already delivered pre-feed and value engineering, and now significantly progressed to the feed phase. And from a regional benefits perspective, and I think this is one of the most critical parts of the projects that we're developing, both in Gladstone and Townsville, is the ability to support the rural and regional economies within which we're developing our projects. So at peak, we'll have about 1,000 construction jobs going, and over the longer term, 20, 30, 50, maybe even longer, depending upon obviously, the ability to continue to refurbish those assets, but over a very long period of time, over 100 ongoing operational jobs. And Project Mandala, very similar in terms of the jobs aspects. We've also received grant funding from Australian DFAT, as well as the Singapore Enterprise entity. That's a larger project though, so that's nearly 400 million litres per annum of production. Excuse me. Having said that though, HEFA is the most commercialised pathway to date, with many technologies and many reference projects available. So notwithstanding it's 4 times the size of Ulysses, that 400 million litre per annum production is well within the bounds of commercialisation, and arguably even sort of a smaller scale than some others being developed today. Just to touch on a few more details, and I think it's better to do it with an image on the screen. So I've given you the highlights there already in the previous slide, but we often get asked, why are you building a project in Townsville? And there's a number of reasons why we are strategically located in that area. On the screen, you can see the Ulysses project site with a bit of a green box around that. So there's a few key reasons for that. The first is that we're about 7 to 8 kilometres away from the port of Townsville. And so when you're thinking about bringing your feedstocks in and your SAF and renewable diesel products out, being close to port from a logistics perspective is really important. The other key aspect of being close to a port is the ability to build very large modules. So we're talking sort of the CapEx element here, off-site in other parts of the world, where you actually can reduce time, reduce cost, reduce risk, factory acceptance test those, and then bring them into the port and then down to the site. So that's one of the key learnings for us in terms of how do you reduce the cost of these projects. At the end of the day, we're talking significant CapEx, and so being closely located to a port is really important for that. We're also surrounded by other sort of heavy industries, so JBS, which is an abattoir, for example, Korea Zinc and their smelter, etc. So when you think about the approvals process in particular, that's really important to be able to be in a site which is designated for this type of activity, ultimately building a biorefinery. And again, just want to say another thanks to the Queensland government, given the support they've given us through the approvals process, of which we are very imminently closing out to have a fully permitted project. The other point to note, which you can't see on the screen but still very important, is that project's about 10 kilometres away from the Laverick barracks. So when we think about fuel security, and there's been no time, more than in Australia today, where people are talking about fuel security challenges and sovereign capability, being 10 kilometres away from the Laverick barracks, which is one of Australia's largest sort of on-ground defence personnel barracks, as well as to about 20 kilometres from the RAF base from an aviation perspective. That's a very strategic location to be closely located for aircraft, land vehicles, and even marine vehicles as well. So lots of interest from the Australian Defence Force around the project for those reasons too. So that's a bit of a snapshot of the rationale for that. I think the other key one to mention too is that site is roughly within the middle of Australia's potential largest theoretical biomass, which is the sugarcane industry, for the ability to convert that into ethanol and then into the A to J pathway for SAF renewable diesel as well. So that's sort of a longer term ambition to be supporting the sugar sector as well. This is a bit of a high level summary of, I guess, the end-to-end process and supply chain for our project. So moving from left to right, look, we buy ethanol. We don't have any further upstream technologies that are required to provide the feedstock. We buy currently available ethanol that's within the Australian market today. That then goes through a 4-stage process. The first is where you remove the water, you dehydrate it to create ethylene. It then goes into the oligomerization process to essentially create longer carbon chains. You hydrogenate that, so you apply hydrogen to that, and then you fractionate or cut it to achieve your kerosene or your diesel length chain molecules. That is then blended, and today the regulations require an up to 50% maximum blending of SAF, which then goes into the aircraft. And so The other important point for us is obviously, yes, we're project developers, but we know we need to monetize our outputs in order to bank these projects. And so from a Scope 1 abatement perspective, that's where the airlines, for example, who are combusting the fuel, get the Scope 1 abatement from a biofuel or from a SAF. And then the Scope 3 aspects, you can either sell the SAF on a bundled basis, where you've got effectively the molecule, the Scope 1 certificate, and the Scope 3 certificate, and you have the full value from that. Or you can actually bifurcate the Scope 1 and the Scope 3 and the molecules even, and sell on a bifurcated basis. So at the end of the day, what we're doing at the moment, spending a lot of time on, is really how do we create the value and monetize each of those revenue streams to create bankability for the project. And it's a very interesting sort of test case here in Australia, given that Qantas has the Qantas Coalition, which are the potential corporate customers for Scope 3 as well. But these are globally traded products at the end of the day. The next project, Mandala. So I've given you again the highlights in the earlier slide, but again, I think it's important to talk about this visually because again, we're located close to a port and even closer in this occasion. So again, all the similar synergies around being close to port, the ability to bring in large modules and reduce time and cost from a CapEx perspective to build the modules, bringing feedstocks in, SAF and renewable diesel going out and all those sorts of things. And again, in a very heavy industrial zoned area as well. So this is only in pre-feed stage at the moment. So we are at an earlier stage compared to Project Ulysses. Having said that, it's a similar playbook in a way in terms of the way that we're developing the project and looking to de-risk in every stage of the process as well. The key difference with this project, though, being the feedstock. So we're not using a bioethanol. We're using other feedstocks such as used cooking oil, tallow, canola, for example, given the technology pathway that we've chosen for that project. Again, another thing people often ask us is why HEFA, why ATJ, why have you selected those pathways? And as I mentioned earlier, for us, it's really about, given we're not a technology development company, we're a very commercial project development company. We've selected those two technology pathways primarily because we believe they'll be the fastest to market, and HEFA is already, at commercial scale and delivering SAF and renewable diesel into the market today. So the snapshot you can see on the screen here is taken from a report done about a year ago by Deloitte and the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, looking at the technology readiness levels of a number of potential technologies in the market. And these are these are evolving very quickly. So HEFA, you can see at the top, there is the most commercialized technology pathway today. And as I said, it's got, the most number of projects deployed and a total capacity globally of about 4 to 5 million tonnes and potentially even more with the projects coming online. The second is the alcohol to jet pathway at a TRL 7 at that time, and that has already evolved to at least a TRL 8 today, given that the LanzaJet technology, again, the technology that we've selected for our project Ulysses, has produced SAF and RD at commercial scale at the back end of last year and working for final commissioning now for steady state operations, which would bring it to a TRL 9. And that's really important in the context of raising capital and creating bankable projects at the end of the day, which is, ultimately my background in banking and finance. And so when we're having conversations with investors and financiers around, raising significant capital for these projects, these are the sorts of questions they ask around the technology readiness and what commercial scale facilities, reference facilities are available to give them the confidence in providing the capital. And I've just got one more slide here. There's lots of discussion at the moment around, what's going on from a government and policy perspective, both on the supply side and the demand side in Australia. So what you can see here is really more of the supply side. So the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, or ARENA, as I said earlier, we've been provided $9 million of grant funding for FEED for Project Ulysses. At the moment, though, ARENA has a $250 million Future Made in Australia Innovation Fund for the low carbon liquid fuel sector, and that's really grants ultimately to support sort of the earlier stage projects through pre-feed, feed, and moving into FID. And then a couple of days ago, they announced a process for the $1.1 billion Cleaner Fuels program for industry and others to be supplying feedback to the design of that. That is currently contemplated to be a production-linked incentive or similar. So it could be a production credit, it could be a CFD, the actual design still being worked through. But that's more revenue support. So, over, for example, a 10-year timeframe to support projects, getting to FID and beyond. And giving that sort of, guaranteed cash flow perspective, again, from a bankability element. From a Queensland government perspective, again, we received $5 million of Project Ulysses for feed in September of 2024. They recently held a grant program for what they call the Sovereign Industry Development Fund. And they also have something else called the Accelerating Fuel Infrastructure Program, which is all about supporting liquid fuel refining and storage capacity, including low carbon liquid fuels. So there's lots going on at both the federal government level and the state government level in terms of, not only funding, but sort of broader support for the industry. And then on the right-hand side, there are 4 specialist investment vehicles, as they're called, or SIVs in Australia. So NAIF, EFA, CFC, and the NRF. And there's over $50 billion of capital available across not just low carbon liquid fuels, but a whole host of other different types of projects and investment opportunities. Each of those have different investment mandates, different eligibility criteria, but Jet Zero's projects, and I believe low carbon liquid fuels more broadly, will be captured under each of those mandates. And they're very interesting because they can provide things like longer tenor, deferred amortization, it could be, concessional financing, really highly structured financial products to get projects like low carbon liquid fuels projects over the line into FID and have the ability to provide equity or debt subject to, again, the mandates of each of them. So again, from a supply side perspective, I think, Australia is quite fortunate to have all of those sort of options available. Look, notwithstanding, I think it's safe to say that, $1.1 billion, for example, of a revenue support, it's not going to be enough to stand up a whole industry. And so that sort of level of funding will need to increase over time, and the support from sort of everyone you can see on the screen over time to increase. But I think it's really positive as a starting point. The missing piece was obviously the demand side, which hasn't yet been implemented in Australia. But really pleasingly, the federal budget a couple of months ago, it was announced that the federal government will work with industry to implement a demand-side measure, and we believe that a consultation for that will be released to industry very soon, with a short turnaround time. And we're all very hopeful that there's a demand-side measure. For example, a mandate will be implemented soon. So then we can marry up the supply side and the demand side and bring the first of these kind of projects to market and create an industry. And that's it for me.
Awesome. Thank you, Mac. Okay. Moving right along, we now have Dave Stribley, who is the co-founder and business development director at Hammer Energy. Hammer Energy is focused on power to liquid and methanol-based fuel pathways. David has diverse experience in the energy sector across technical, commercial, and project management roles, both in Australia and the Middle East. And today, David will be presenting on the methanol to jet project in South Australia, outlining how the project fits into the SAF supply chain. Welcome, David.
Thanks, Shahana, and thank you to Bioenergy Australia for setting this up. Hopefully you can all see my screen in full now. Excellent. So first, Shahana recognised at the start of the meeting, but our sites actually spread across quite a diverse area within both Victoria and South Australia. So where we will be building these assets sit on the Gundit Mering people's land, which is in southwest Victoria, and that's also where we'll be getting most of our feedstock. So we work very closely with them around that. And then the methanol to jet plant, which will be our location for our SAF facility, will be at the Ghana people's land, based there in Adelaide. So I'd like to recognise the lands in which those assets will ultimately be built. So today I'll give a little bit of background on our flagship project, which is a fully integrated supply chain from raw biomass from the forestry industry all the way through to SAF. Little bit of background on Hammer Energy. We were founded in 2021. We are very much focused on decarbonisation of hard to abate sectors. So we will talk about SAF today. We're also very active in the maritime sector as well. And we ultimately also believe that the chemical sectors will also be looking at liquid fuels or liquid chemicals to decarbonise. You'll see as we go through the presentation today, our project evolves really around methanol as being our core feedstock. And that really being because it's an ability to produce methanol from different pathways and ultimately scale that as we see technologies change, and scale it as you have different feedstock ultimately to get projects off the ground. We announced earlier this year, similar to Jet Zero, that we took investment from Qantas and Airbus, which was very exciting. We also have investors in ThyssenKrupp and Honeywell. And also last week we announced funding from the Australian Renewable Energy Agency under their Low Carbon Liquid Fuels Innovation Fund to the tune of 32 million, which we're extremely supportive or thankful of for ARENA providing that funding to move into the next phase of front-end engineering design. Our flagship project, which is Project Shearwater, it will target first production in 2031. And at this stage, we're targeting 140 million litres of SAF under development, which will be located in Adelaide. The project is spread across a diverse area, and that really relates to the feedstock. So we are using forestry residue as our primary feedstock. There are 3 assets across the structure here. The first one is a biohub. So this is located in the middle of the Green Triangle region, which straddles Mount Gambier through to the Port of Portland. This asset will be located in the forest region as it's very hard to move biomass around. So it's located in a central area, reducing our cost. The next phase is the methanol upgrading, where we take that low-grade feedstock and upgrade that. And then our final processing, which is the core of the hub, is the SAF park, which will be located in Adelaide. There's a little bit going on this chart, but this steps through the overall process flow at a high level. So we start with forestry residues. We've really focused on that as our core feedstock due to a number of reasons. It's abundance. It's a very large resource. The Green Triangle produces over 8 million tonnes of final fibre to date. And alongside that, there's a lot of residues and products that are underutilised. We do use hydrogen, just like any refinery does use hydrogen today. That hydrogen is used to ultimately upgrade that biomass into its final product of methanol. And that methanol plant will be located there in Portland. We've teamed up with ThyssenKrupp Uhde out of Germany for the technology package here. TK will be supplying the complete package from biomass in the front end all the way through to the final methanol at the back end. We'll be using their technology that is fundamentally built on coal technology. And again, one of the reasons we've done that is around its bankability, that they've rolled out that technology globally before. We do stop at the methanol pathway there. We see that being a very good commercial balance where we have a product that can go to different markets should markets change. It's also a commodity that we can trade globally. So it allows us some flexibility around what we do with that methanol. We then move to our next stage, our SAF Energy Park, which will be located in Adelaide. We've teamed up here with Honeywell as our supplier. This process received ASTM approval, which I think Mac went through in the last pack, only this year, which is very exciting. And that process goes through a similar process to the ethanol to jet pathway. And our final customers at the back end there. So as I said, the biohub, this will be located centrally within the Green Triangle. This allows us to process the biomass and essentially densify it before we need to do further transport. This optimizes our cost structure, allowing us not to move bulk biomass too far. The process does go through what's called a torrefication process. This removes the moisture and increases the energy density of that final product. It also makes it look very consistent with coal, which means that we can use it in the next step of the process. The Portland Renewable Fuels Project, this is the biomethanol facility. This facility will produce upwards of 300,000 tonnes per annum of green methanol. It will utilise 600,000 tonnes of green biomass from the biohub. It is a large-scale development. It is a big chemical plant. The best way to consider this is it uses technology that is already done today, particularly in China, where we use coal as a feedstock to make methanol. In this instance, we're displacing that coal and using biomass through that. It is also a large-scale user of hydrogen. The hydrogen, I guess, supercharges that biomass conversion process and allows us to actually increase our yield. It's really important because what it allows us to do is, instead of having a relatively small volume and a lot of biomass, it actually allows us to almost double our overall production. And one of the constraints in a lot of bio projects is moving enough biomass. The next phase of the overall development is our hub located in Adelaide. This will be, I guess, the core piece of infrastructure that we'll be building at the back of this project. This is a methanol to jet project. As I said, this received ASTM approval just recently. The facility will be located very close to a port, which allows us to bring in large-scale modules and also bring product in from multiple locations. Our strategy here is really around a hub and spoke model, and that is how we ultimately phase our development. So the first phase is looking at producing 140 million litres. We do have capacity here for multiple trains, and going down the methanol pathway allows us to bring in methanol from other locations, really as we see demand for the product scale over time, recognising that obviously demand is the core thing, making sure we have a customer at the back end. Honeywell have been selected for this process. We are now in front-end engineering design with them and working through the next phase of development. The goal is to have the facility up and running by 2031. So that was a very quick overview of our overall project. If you've got any questions, you can see the team here, and please reach out, and happy to answer any questions.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Dave. Okay, well now, if I can get all of the panelists to have their cameras on and their mics on, I'm going to go through. We did receive a lot of questions leading up to the webinar, so I've got quite a few here that we can jump into. The first one, and I think some of you did cover this off in your presentations, but we've had a question around what's the funding arrangement for these projects, debt versus equity, and who is taking the debt. So maybe Dave, did you want to?
Yeah, I can have a crack, but you might be best with Mac being an ex-banker.
You can lead up to back.
I mean, ultimately, I think all the developers here on the line, we will all be using a combination of debt and equity to fund these projects. We're not big Shell or those sort of entities that could equity finance these whole things. So there'll be a combination of those. I think ultimately, the more we can make them look like a core piece of infrastructure and bring in that debt, I think we'll make it work. And that's going to come down to the tenor of both feedstock and offtake, ultimately, I think. So, but Mac, you'll have some good views on how we structure these up.
Mac?
Yeah, thanks, guys. We often say at Jet Zero that the financial engineering is going to be just as important, just as hard as the technical engineering. And the reason being, I think it's sort of partly a challenge, but partly an opportunity. Excuse me. The fact that, and I touched on it earlier in my slides, there's an opportunity for grants, there's an opportunity for a sort of supply side revenue support mechanism, which is the Cleaner Fuels program. There's equity, which could be all private sector equity or potentially concessional equity, so the likes of the 4 government, SIVs that I mentioned earlier. There's the commercial banking market, both domestically and internationally, and then there's also the SIVs with their debt as well. So it could be that we're looking at a capital stack, so basically all of the types of different capital within the project, and it could be 7 to 10 players playing a role, which is not surprising given a first of a kind project, and even things we've seen in other, like solar and wind and those sorts of projects, and batteries, for example, and traditional renewables. When you're talking about first of kind projects, you need to pull all the levers to support that. So if I think about Jet Zero's experience, look, we're talking to the Queensland government about potential grants. We're talking to ARENA about grants. The Cleaner Fuels program will obviously submit something into. We're talking to all the 4 government SIVs that I had on the screen earlier, whether that be debt, equity, or a combination. We're talking to the domestic banks around the role they can play. And earlier this year, we actually appointed SNBC and BNP, which is a sort of respective Japanese and French bankers structuring banks, given their experience in the Sky Energy project in Amsterdam, which is the first ever non-recourse project financed SAF project. So I find it really exciting, actually, notwithstanding it's going to be really hard to pull it all together, but that's just the nature of doing anything that's a first of its kind in any country. Over time, I'd like to think that these become more infrastructure-like projects where it's the private sector sort of, you don't need the role of the government as much over time. So the private sector is taking on that role, but I can't foresee that in the first few projects. But the fact that we've got the availability of all of that funding through the various different mechanisms that I've talked to is very useful. But we also still need the demand side to be supporting to ensure that there's a demand signal for not only building the projects, but supplying the molecules into the market at the right price as well.
Awesome. Andrea, did you have any thoughts or any kind of learnings from internationally projects that you guys have been involved in?
Yeah, I mean, echo what Max said. I think these first projects will really require a stack of different capital and support both on the demand and supply side. I think the role of supply side incentives is critical in these early projects. Certainly our experience in British Columbia, where there is a low carbon fuel standard, has enabled, to sort of bridge that funding gap, particularly for first of kind facilities. So, and I think the ability to be able to stack different incentives. So again, just removing some of those hurdles towards getting to an FID position and funding these first of kind projects. And then I think the role of strategic partners, which you can see with all of these projects, having those cornerstone investors and strategic partners to help crowd in more funding. And then over time, as the market develops and the projects, become more readily available in terms of accessing the private capital, I do think that it won't be as challenging, but certainly in the first instance, I think that's a huge role for government, both to set those appropriate policies and also provide access to grant funding for these first facilities would be really important.
Awesome. Fraser, did you have anything that you wanted to add?
I think the only thing I'd add is that at the Renewable Fuel Summit in March this year, there was a really good panel where we had a bunch of debt providers who talked about some of the lessons learned. And I guess one of my sort of takeaways from that was that, no disrespect to our Australian debt colleagues, but like the international debt market is far more advanced and understand the risks and how to finance these projects. So I found it fascinating to hear about the likes of Deutsche Bank and ING, how they funded some of those deals in Europe. So for any of those who are thinking about the debt opportunities, I think, engaging some of those international debt players, I think is a really important step.
Awesome. Thanks, Fraser. Probably, actually, I'll stick with you, Fraser, on this one. So one of the questions here is around, apart from scalability and cost, what is the biggest challenge for the SAF industry in Australia moving forward? So outside of scalability and cost.
Well, I think that the cost thing, we have to just be a bit nuanced with this, because sometimes, we misread this, and there's a lot of myths that go around about saying the cost of this, if SAF is initially 4 to 6 times, this is what it's going to mean for your cost of your flight, or this is what it's going to mean for your renewable diesel. That's not the case, and I think both Mac and David spoke to this, is that there is a blending aspect of this, and we've done modelling work which shows that if you look at sustainable aviation fuel, if you get a 5% blend in Australia, which is a really meaningful demand signal, that's less than the cost of a cup of coffee for one-way flights in Australia. In fact, I paid $9 for a cup of coffee in Tullamarine recently, so it's actually like half the cost of a cup of coffee in the airport. So just goes to show that actually, when we think about cost, we should be just cognizant that it's actually, because of the blending aspect of this, it's a lot more manageable. In terms of, though, the key gaps, I think we've spoken about this, it is the demand side signal. And if you look across the world, there's over 65 countries now that have a demand side signal in for low carbon fuels, and many more are in the process. Australia has announced that we will be doing this, but the key is really in the detail. The design of this, what's the volumes on this, what are the commitments, what's the coverage for different types of fuels. The real detail will be important. And I think once we have that, there are a number of other issues that we still need to address, and contingency requirements and some of the other the counterparty risk, which can, and tenor length of contracts. But for me, it all starts with that demand side mechanism.
Okay, great. Anyone else want to jump in on that one?
The only thing I'd add, Shahana, and I totally agree with Fraser in terms of the demand side, the challenge potentially for Australia is if they don't implement something soon, then the products go offshore, which is obviously not the outcome we want. So, like Fraser mentioned, 64, 65 countries, the Asia Pacific region, it's almost every month where another country is either implementing a mandate or announcing that to come in soon. There was an article, I think today or yesterday, about Japan's now, resolved what theirs is going to look like come 2030. And the UK and the EU obviously are the most progressive markets. So I think it's really a case of the projects in Australia will be built, given the levels of support already available and sort of the way the markets are going. But we obviously want to keep that product onshore where we possibly can, and we need the signal to support that.
Yeah, great. And this is probably a question for, in particular, the project developers. And it's something that I don't think we've really spent a lot of time talking about yet, because as the industry body, we've been very much focused on getting the market moving. But one of the questions here is around competition for talent in project delivery is on the rise, and how is the SAF industry positioned in Australia to be a destination of choice? So, as project developers, are you finding it challenging in terms of finding that talent here domestically, and are we a destination of choice, I guess, in terms of global talent wanting to come and work on these sorts of projects? So Mac, you've got the floor, so maybe you can start off, and then we'll go to Dave and Andrea.
Yeah, happy to kick off. I think there's huge opportunity in Australia. We are constantly getting people wanting to come and join Jet Zero, and not just sort of, I should say, like across the board, whether it's engineering, technical, finance. We're very strong interest in what we're doing, which is great. We don't have the need for that at the moment. We're a very lean team. We're a good team, good experience. And so in our current phase, we don't need that. But we're, keeping tabs on all of those people, because over time, as the business grows, we'll need that. Look, I think Australia's got a very strong pedigree in major project delivery. If I think about whether it's LNG, coal historically, gas, what's going on renewables at the moment, there's lots of infrastructure development across various sectors. So there's lots of good, strong credibility and capability in doing that. And as new industries emerge, again, we've got that. I think if I think about the most sort of analogous sector, refining, we've shut down many refineries over the last 20 years. And so some of that capability might be a bit more challenging. But having said that, there's no shortage of talent internationally looking to come and support the project. So I think we'll be fine in terms of whether it's already onshore or bringing it in country, given it's such an interesting sector. And I think actually it's an opportunity. If I think about Townsville and we've got a local university there, we're thinking about programs for some of those university students coming through into the industry and those sorts of things. So I think whether it's existing capability or developing new capability, particularly in the rural and regional areas, we think that's really important. So I don't think we'll have a shortage. It's just we've got to get the industries to a scale where we can actually start to deploy those people, and that's a critical piece.
Awesome. Dave?
Yeah, I think well said, Mac, and I'd echo what you said. I think from our side of things, what we're seeing is there's quite a lot of experience out there in that refining area. I mean, we've had, and a good example is probably Jet Zero and Hammer, and we're largely Exxon based, and the Jet Zero team have some Shell based people. We do run a risk, though, that ultimately that experience is probably getting older in terms of, and how do we bring younger people into this industry? And ultimately, if we don't keep that industry going in the background, a lot of that expertise could leave, which would be a real shame. So I think it's almost like car manufacturing. Once you lose that technology or that experience, it's very hard to ever recreate it. So I think it's quite a good time for this industry to be picking up good talent and building out this new industry. But if we leave it too late and we start to see some of that experience go, then it could become really challenging. The other piece we're seeing is obviously we're using technology suppliers from all over the world. So we've got ThyssenKrupp and Honeywell. They've got a lot of interest for all of their different technology packages. So even from a government level, making sure it's very clear that this is an industry that is going to happen in Australia is really important to get your technology providers to actually put the effort towards these sort of projects. And that's really important, as Mac also said, around just the timing of these things. It is a global industry, and we are tapping on global resources. And that also goes for global capital ultimately as well. But at the moment, there's some really, really good people out there. So, yeah.
Andrea.
Yeah, no, look, to add to that, I would agree. I think we're really fortunate in Australia that we do have some really deep talent, you know, and I think a very entrepreneurial mindset, because we have been developing this industry in the absence of policy. And while, you know, we're optimistic that those policies will be coming, it has meant, I think, that we've had to be a little bit more strategic and think outside the box. We've got a really exciting feedstock advantage, and I think that attracts not just companies but individuals to Australia. A lot of companies that potentially a lot of countries, sorry, that potentially have more developed markets have, you know, potentially a feedstock and scaling challenge. So I think, you know, we operate in a global market that includes attracting global talent. I think Lysella, we're fortunate. We're in probably a unique position in terms of low carbon fuel projects in Australia, being that we're both the technology owner and developer and the project developer. I think that gives us a unique cross-section of skills and capabilities within the organisation, and we can really, I guess, have that sort of breadth as well as the depth with the people. We've been very supportive of nurturing and trying to incubate that next generation of talent as well, both on the commercial and technical side, but we do offer internships and graduate positions, and we've had some amazing candidates come through, both spending a short amount of time, but then also, you know, coming and working with us sort of as they finish their university degrees as well. So I do think that you know, focus not just on the management and that sort of strategic executive level, but also having that new pool of talent coming in on the ground level as well is really important to bring that fresh perspective in, because we're building a new industry, so it's not always going to be the same rule book that applies to, you know, other conventional large infrastructure projects. So yeah, I mean, I certainly think we're actually quite fortunate in Australia, but keeping nurturing that next generation as well, I think, is really important.
Awesome, thank you. Now, this is and it's a good question, but I don't know how much you guys will be willing to share in terms of your views. But we have a question around the $1.1 billion Cleaner Fuels program, and asking the project developers what is actually needed in that 1.1 billion in order to support your project. So the specifics in terms of when you've thought about it, actually what is needed in order for it to make a difference. Fraser, I might, and I know that you're not developing an individual project, but I would be keen to hear your views, maybe just to kick it off in terms of the work that you've been doing, looking at the 1.1 billion in supply side support, just your thinking at the moment, and then go to the project developers.
Yeah, happy to. And you know, Bioenergy Australia did a great submission to the government on early on about thinking about ideas on that program. And thank you to Georgie, who kind of quarterbacked that effort and put all the different opinions into something very coherent. I won't go through all of that, but I think one of the things I would say is that yes, there's a lot of focus on production tax credits, which all that is valuable. But we did some modelling around what would shift the needle the most. And you know, beyond a demand side mechanism, which is crucial, there are other additive layers which are really crucial. So a revenue certainty mechanism, like has been done in the UK, becomes a really important lever, because you know, yes, you can have a demand side mechanism, but then it's the quality of that offtake. And the reality is that many of the airlines, their credit ratings are not as great as they could be, and that's why some have substituted airports for airlines. It's difficult for them to put the tenor length that would be ideal, and there's a series of other aspects which actually can inflate the costs, and that translates to effectively higher weighted average cost of capital at the end of the day for these projects. So we'll be releasing some work soon around that kind of revenue certainty mechanism as one idea, and we did the modelling to show how much it could reduce the cost of production, and it is really significant, and it is potentially off balance sheet for government, which is another important piece of this puzzle.
Yeah, great. Mac, did you want to throw in what you guys need?
Look, I think at a high level, Shana, it's just got to give a high level of confidence to investors, but particularly project finance lenders on that being bankable ultimately. What I would say though is whilst it's a really good lever, in isolation, it's not going to work. Like we've done some modelling, probably similar to Fraser, and looked at, what would, if, for example, $100 million of grant funding up front do to the cost of the SAF at the back end versus, taking half of that cleaner fuels program. And so call it $550 million. It's roughly the same, but you have to get 5 times the benefit over 10 years to reduce the price. So as I said earlier, I think Australia is fortunate to have so many different levers available, but we'll need all of them to play a role, at least in the first projects, to get those away. But in short, when it's talking specifically about the CFP, it's just got to give the lenders in particular confidence that they're going to get the benefit of that, because they'll be sizing their debt quantums and utilizing that as a premise of which to think about how much debt they can actually lend to a project, which again has impacts of reducing the cost of the WACC and therefore the cost of the end products as well.
Any other comments? Clean fuels?
I think
Andrea?
just to add, I mean, I agree in terms of revenue certainty mechanisms, and I think incentives will play a really important role on the supply side. Our position is that demand measure alone will not be enough. We need both. And I think that's where there's an opportunity potentially to help incentivize emission reduction. So if the government decides in the first instance to, approach the demand mechanism with a volume-based mandate, I think then that's, how critical emission and incentivizing emission reduction will be on the supply side. And that's a model that's worked well in a number of markets overseas. And certainly I think it's the way that the demand and supply side play together that helps to reduce those sort of investment hurdles and sort of help projects get to a bankable position.
Thanks, Andrea. Dave?
Got lots of views on this one, but
share, please.
Look, Fraser said it quite well. I mean, ultimately, it's about where do these risks sit, and when we're trying to finance these projects, what those look like. And I think one of the challenges in a market that doesn't have good price discovery, the SAF market is not a big, deep market. Even if you go and look at indices out of Singapore, the actual traded volume is very small. So no bank can go and look at a price and say, there's my futures sort of outlook, there's my historicals, and I'm going to take this view on what that world looks like. And that makes it very hard for customers ultimately to lock in to some sort of offtake that is ultimately bankable. And I think there are off-takers out there, but we're asking them to take a big risk in doing that in a market that, if we're asking for a 10-year offtake agreement, if you think about our project, that means they're still the core offtaker in 2041. The world is very different probably then. So our view is some sort of contract for difference that really underwrites that risk, both for the off-takers, so they have certainty that if they come in, they commit to these projects, that they are not exposed with some massive liability sitting on their books. Now, ultimately, that contract for difference might end up costing the government very little. As Fraser sort of mentioned, there are ways that you could structure that, but it's really to balance that risk where the government can use their balance sheet to take that risk, and that allows bankers and the debt and equity providers really to have that revenue certainty on the back end, which is what they're looking for to get these projects away. So we think some form of contract for difference or revenue certainty, like we've seen in UK, will ultimately have the biggest impact. It is challenging, though, in terms of just the quantum. So you do need to have both the supply and the demand. If you were trying to bridge to fossil jet, you might get a year's worth of ultimate supply. So you need to make sure your demand side vision is linked with your supply side support as well. And I'd also echo what Andrea said. You also need to make sure that's all linked with carbon intensity. It's quite a challenge to get all of those pieces of the pie joining together. So, yeah.
That's
Good
a
question.
great segue to the next question, which is around ISCC and CORSIA. So, to what extent does or will ISCC and CORSIA certification play a role in Australia? And I suppose then, following on from that, looking at Australia's vast resources around feedstocks and the opportunity that we have here. So, I might, Dave. Interesting project. Keen to hear your views around CORSIA and ISCC and how important that's going to be in terms of progressing projects here and making fuels available for sale, I guess, and relevant.
Yeah, so I think particularly in the markets we are operating, we're talking about SAF here. It's an international market. I think it's really important that, ultimately we are going to make a CORSIA compliant fuel. That's our goal. That's what we talk to customers about. And that's all they ultimately are talking to us about, is we just want a CORSIA compliant fuel. So I think it's really important, and it's actually one of Australia's strengths, is because we are a very transparent marketplace and we are well regulated, that we should lean into having highly compliant fuels. That is a competitive advantage Australia has compared to potential other markets where traceability around feedstock is not as good. And we will arguably be a more expensive place, but people will they will pay a premium to have that transparency. So we focus predominantly on CORSIA. We are also ISCC certified because we do some biofuels trading today. And again, it comes down to what the customer is asking for. They ask for ISCC certified product, we'll deliver an ISC certified product. I think CORSIA is important because ultimately CORSIA also covers other sustainability elements of an airline. So they like to say they're CORSIA compliant within the sustainability framework, not just the carbon intensity of the fuel. If we end up going for a product in Australia that does not meet with those requirements, I think we could ultimately do ourselves a bit of a disservice because I think it's an advantage we have. But yeah.
Great. Matt, your views?
Yeah, I guess similar today. The view we've always taken is we want to have the most saleable products we possibly can. So ISCC and CORSIA, yes, RSB as well. Some customers favour one over the other. So at the end of the day, our view is, well, let's just be as certified as we possibly can. Let's have the most saleable product we possibly can. And that way we're able to sell into essentially any market that we may need to. As I said earlier, we want to be keeping as much of this product onshore as we possibly can, but at the end of the day, we need to make commercially rational decisions for the business. And so we need at least the opportunity to be selling overseas if we ever had to as well. So look, these are revolving markets, and so trying to keep up with them is pretty tricky, to be honest with you, but our view has always been RSB, ISC and CORSIA. If anything else comes out in future, we'll manage that as well, but it's how do we make sure that we have the most saleable products we possibly can.
And Matt, I suppose just following on from that question, in terms of the emissions intensity scorings within CORSIA of different feedstocks, Australia is, for some feedstocks, considered a disadvantage, and that it isn't necessarily kind of up to date with Australia's ag sector. What's your kind of experience there in terms of engaging in new feedstocks and being able to evolve, I suppose, CORSIA to be more relevant to the Australian market?
Yeah, look, we're taking a sort of specific project view. So we'll do an LCA with an external consultant to externally validate that for all of our projects. We've already done that on Ulysses, obviously the most advanced project, and that evolves as you go through your feed phase and all those sorts of things. So whilst there might be certain benchmarks globally, we want to make sure that we've got something specific for our project, and a lot of the people that customers we're talking to want that as well. Again, that has the opportunity to make our products more saleable in different markets when you can point to an externally validated report that says your carbon intensity is whatever the number might be. Look, it is tricky because we've got multiple projects, multiple technologies, different feedstocks, and so to navigate that can be challenging. But at the end of the day, our customers want to know that, again, and Dave mentioned the word transparency earlier. We're big believers in that too. We want to make sure that there is full transparency and credibility on the whole supply chain. We're ultimately talking about insets here and not offsets. It's within that value chain. And so we want to make sure that we are being, very consistent and very transparent with our approach for all of our customers.
Yeah, great. Andrea?
Completely agree. I think everything that we do has to be interoperable with international markets, both because we need to make a saleable product for a global market, and both, whether we're talking about aviation or shipping, these are global markets with global obligations under international frameworks. So I don't think we should be our view is that we shouldn't be developing Australian specific, I guess, and the question becomes, how do you challenge some of those defaults under CORSIA if it's not a fit for purpose for the Australian market? But I think we run the risk of, unnecessary complexity with the way that we certify and trace the products if we are making new frameworks that aren't sort of in alignment with those international standards and practices. So I think CORSIA has to be CORSIA certified on the SAF front. And then I think, as Max said, depending on the customer, it might be a preference for ISCC or RSB. But either way, the same transparency, traceability frameworks, and the way that it's regulated, those principles are very much the same, irrespective of which sort of carbon accounting schemes used.
Great. Fraser, any feedback?
I want to talk about the certification schemes because I think that's all well covered. But I would make the point that I did some quick back of the envelope estimation the other day saying that if we were to achieve that sort of CSIRO 2050 target, then roughly about 70% of our fuel supplies through low carbon fuels, like what would it mean in terms of land requirements? You have to make lots of assumptions by feedstocks and so forth. So it took a variety of different feedstocks. And it would be roughly around sort of 4 million hectares. So Australia's got about 10 to 12 million hectares of arable land. So if we were to do this in a silly way of like competing using food feedstocks and trying to divert them to fuel, we are quickly going to run up into issues around social license and backlash. So we do need to think about, as we scale this industry, and all the projects here have been thoughtful about that already, of thinking about residue products and how to take advantage of that. But also, how do we bring in the kind of marginal degraded land in Australia? Like, we have 400 million hectares of marginal degraded land. And so this goes beyond just a narrow view of the certification frameworks. But as we think about what does a fit for purpose, scalable scheme look like to make Australia truly a global powerhouse in low carbon fuels, I think we need to start looking at those feedstock questions. And it's good to see the Department of Agriculture is already kicking off some good work trying to think about that feedstock innovation aspect.
Awesome. Okay, bit of a tricky question. We have the federal government, hopefully in the next couple of weeks, coming out with a consultation paper on the demand side measure, which is a commitment that they have made. Obviously, that's essential, and I think everybody has reinforced that in the presentations today, that supply and demand side support are really both critically needed to be able to progress the industry. I'm keen on each of you providing your thoughts on what is needed in that demand side measure for your project to move. What's the key clincher that has to be in it in order for your project to move? Fraser, I might, just because you're straddling multiple projects, what are your thoughts?
I was hoping to borrow from the other speakers on this one. Look, I guess, at least if I'm there, you're not going to ask them saying that you need to have a requirement that you buy from Hammer, Lasella or Jet Zero. So, but look, I think for me, we looked at it and there's like 30 different characteristics in terms of design of mechanisms that we see globally. So it gets complex pretty quickly. I sort of, if I'm simplifying it though, the core of it has to be, what's the year that it's coming in? And what are the volumes that are going to be there? And then thirdly, what's the trajectory after that? So, the year, the starting point, volume, and the trajectory. And there's different ways. That can be a standard, that could be a mandate, but having those three building blocks are really core. So I guess what I'm hoping for is that we see a year which aligns with the financial close of some of the projects that we have here, a volume that is sufficient enough that gives us kind of confidence that it's sending a really clear demand signal, and a trajectory that shows that it matches with what we believe and we've seen around the feedstock potential and the growth that we see here in Australia.
Awesome. Andrea?
Okay, well, I probably have quite strong views, which I'm sure lots of people
Good.
do. But I think that there's, to Fraser's point around phasing, and I think being pragmatic around what is actually required in the early stages for those first wave of projects to become bankable. And that might be a purely volumetric obligation, and recognizing that pathways like HEFA are going to be able to be in a position to deliver some early scale. I do think if we don't move over time towards a carbon intensity performance measure, that we're going to potentially create some hurdles for other technologies outside of HEFA that can potentially unlock more abundant or lower carbon intensity feedstock. So I do think that when the government's developing it, it would be good to think about the timing of those. If initially there is a sort of volumetric obligation with a relatively low CI hurdle, I do think there's a risk that it's going to put up some hurdles in terms of attracting investment into other pathways if it's just a purely volumetric measure on a relatively low CI benchmark. So I do think that if that needs to be time bound, and we need to ensure that there's some certainty that at a point, whether it's after 12, 18 months or whatever the case may be with the time frame of when the policy comes online, that it does within the demand side measure, there is a linkage over time to carbon intensity. And this is, I think, also the role for complementary supply side mechanisms, whereby, having a demand there that may be more volume based, but we need to also incentivize investment into those pathways that are not just going to deliver early volume, but are going to deliver that scale and those sort of deeper carbon intensity reductions over time. So I think that's the role of how demand and supply potentially works together.
Awesome. Dave?
Yeah, maybe we've got 3 minutes, so I'll be really quick. Maybe I'll follow Fraser's guidance there around those regions. But yeah, I agree, very important. We'd probably advocate you could start earlier with very small scale imports. And the reason we think that's important is just getting the industry ready. There's a whole heap of not just technical things we need to get ready for, but just also social license. People seeing planes flying with jet fuel, that SAF, for instance, and not even thinking about it and just saying, oh, this is suddenly the norm, so that when big projects do come on, we're not actually having to deal with that social license piece of using sustainable aviation fuel. It turns out, oh, actually, we've already been doing this. It's now just domestically produced. So that's one difference we would probably say is we could start actually pretty early, even though it does start with imports. That also allows us to start building out those supply chains as needed. One thing you didn't raise, Fraser, was just the scope. Sort of what are we looking at? We're just talking about SAF here. I think more broadly, we think ultimately that sustainable aviation fuel and diesel are probably the two very hard to abate sectors that would make the most sense to focus on. That said, we think there's also a big role for things like ethanol, because as we build that industry out, we can then look at ethanol to jet in the future as well. So I think that's a tricky one. On volume, ultimately, I think volume should be a stretch. Like, it needs to have an element of hard to get to. Otherwise, we're not going to see projects coming in. And we need to make sure on the trajectory side of things that this is looking 10 to 15 years ahead, because ultimately the banks are going to be looking at funding these projects for 10 to 15 years. So it does have to demonstrate to them that there's certainty around that demand side policy. And then there's a heap of other things we could go through, but yeah, Mac, you've got a minute.
Mac, you get to close us out, Mac.
I think I agree with everything that's been said. If I take a step back though, from a governmental perspective, like what are they trying to achieve? And for me, we want projects to be built, we want jobs to be created, we want fuels to be produced and used in country primarily. And so the mechanism really has to support all of those things. Otherwise, we're going to be in a situation where, either we're producing fuels with projects and jobs, but it's all going offshore, or we're just importing all of these things, or feedstocks are going offshore, and then we're buying back things that have already been value added overseas. So I think we've got all of the opportunity in front of us. We've got all of the pieces of the puzzle that are coming together, which is good. And this is sort of that final piece, which I think that the government is fully aware of, given we've been sort of consulting on this probably for 2 to 3 years already. So we're at the very pointy end, and I think we'll get the right outcome. But it's really a case of, as I said, and look, one thing, fuel security as well. We probably haven't touched on that enough today. We're in a current fuel crisis. Seems like we're in crises every couple of years at the moment. And we really need fuel security, and it's an opportunity for all of us on this call and all of the attendees to be supporting as well. So I'll leave it there.
Awesome. Well, thank you, everyone, and thanks for joining us. As I said, we had over 360 people registered for this webinar, so thanks for sharing all of your views and being incredibly open about how your projects are progressing. Thank you for Georgie and the team for pulling this together. And once again, a reminder, any ideas or suggestions that you have of webinars that you think would be of interest, please do get in touch with us. As we said, we're trying to run one every couple of weeks, and it really is starting to develop into a great program. So have a wonderful rest of the week, guys. Thank you so much.